There's this feeling we all get when we see photos of our parents before we knew them. It's an unfamiliarity with someone so familiar. When looking at old pictures of them, you can't help but wonder if you're similar to them in any way. Whether the younger version of them looks like you or acts like you. You can't help but wonder if you knew them back then, would you have been friends with them? Do their younger selves resemble the person you know, or is the person you know completely separate? As a kid, I remember falling asleep to my dad telling me stories from when he was young. He would tell me stories of homemade haunted houses and trespassing in backcountry Greenwich to go fishing, but the story that I always wanted to hear over and over again was the time my dad and his two friends got stuck in Chibougamau, Canada. I've heard this story from my dad countless times, but the thing I've wondered throughout the years is how do Ned and Brian remember this experience? How is it different than the way my dad remembers it? And that's what I found out.
Hi, my name is Brian Chutka, and I was a part of one of the three men that had this heroic adventure into the Canadian Northeast and managed to come out alive after 7.5, 8 days of being trapped in the wilderness, 120 miles from the nearest living human being, and only way in and out was by aircraft.
My name is Ned. I'm Bill's cousin. I don't know what else to say other than I really don't even remember the date of the fishing trip. I don't remember what year it was.
My name is Bill Moore, and this is a story about fishing in Canada where my friends Brian, Ned, and I almost got killed. This happened in 1976. We were in a place called Lake Kashika in the Seneca Park in Quebec, and we were fishing parts of the Broadback River.
We put this trip together a couple years earlier in quest of finding the world's largest brook trout. And this was our third trip into the wilderness, and we were using canoes. And it just happened that we had one big 21-foot canoe, I believe it was. We called it a war canoe because it was so big.
We did what we do up there. We negotiated a canoe rental. We brought our own tents and food and everything. And we got dropped. We got dropped. It was probably about 60 miles out from the town on a float plane. And they're called beavers and otters. They're pre-World War II float planes.
The canoe rentals in Canada are a lot different than they are here. They don't have Coast Guard rules and regulations. So they don't, in the United States, if you rent a canoe, they have to provide you with a life preserver. And there were none. The guy said, if you flip over, you swim. Needless to say, that's what happened. And
we got dropped on an island, and it was nice. It was a place we could set up a camp. We had a little beach. We fished. It was fun. This was our third time up there. And we were traveling this time. We went our first time in travel, second time we had a base camp. This time we were traveling.
On this particular trip, we flew into Lake Kashika, and which was in the preserve, one of the native preserves from the Cree Indians. And we had to get permission to fly into this particular place, which eventually became a part of the Broadback River. As we went in, it was a beautiful, beautiful day when we entered the wilderness and watched the airplane take off after he left us there where we were going to build a campsite. There was no existing campsite where we were. And we would then build a campsite and begin our fishing trip, which was absolutely wonderful. The first couple days we caught terrific fish, large brook trout, some as big as 24, 25 inches long, 5-6 pounders, really good sized fish.
And we got onto this big lake. And this was going to be part of our journey. It was about 70 miles. This lake was about 10 or 12 miles long. We camped up at the top of it, and we got up the next morning, so this is probably our third day out there. And we paddled, and it was windy, it was cloudy. It gets cold up there. It's about the second week in June. And we must have gone about 2 or 3 miles. We stopped on an island. And I remember I ate a can of peaches, and those guys gave me shit about it later because they hadn't eaten anything. We probably paddled another couple of miles. We got to a big cove. And my memory is that Ned wanted to kind of paddle around the edge of this cove and keep going, and I just wanted to go across. And by my reckoning, it was probably 4 times longer to go Ned's way. And we decided, let's just go across. So it wasn't like Ned said, I'm not going to do it. We did it. And this is where the problem came. We got about halfway across, and it started to rain. And it started to rain so hard, there was like no space between the raindrops. It was kind of scary. I remember I was in the back of the boat. I looked down, and I could see the boat filling. And just as I was kind of processing that, the boat lifted right up out of the water. And we, I guess, got caught in like a twister or tornado, whatever it was. I mean, we're 1,000 miles from where we live, so we don't know what the weather pattern is like up there. But it flipped our boat up in the air like a pancake and flipped us over, and all of our stuff came out. We didn't have life jackets because they take up too much room. We're kind of stupid. I think at the time I was probably 23 years old. And you get plunged into the water, and the ice is out around the 3rd week of May. It's 2nd week of June. It's cold. It's really cold.
Thunder, lightning, the wind picked up, and the lake turned into, it was scary. It was really scary.
The cooler popped up. It had like a little string on it or a rope, and I think Brian either cut it or it broke, but he grabbed our igloo cooler. The boat was one of these boats that had a square tail for a motor. We didn't have a motor, but it had a fitting for it, so it went straight up and down in the water. It had styrofoam in the bow of it.
Ned was holding on to the side of the canoe as it was sinking. Bill was holding on to the side of the canoe as it was sinking. And I was by myself when the igloo cooler that we had our meats in popped up out of nowhere. But it was tied to the side of the canoe. We had tied it into the side of the canoe. When it popped up, it was buoyant like a buoy. 2.5 feet across, 18 inches wide, 25 inches deep maybe. So I grabbed the canoe, and I had my knife on my side, and I cut the rope that had it attached to the canoe, because if the canoe sank, I didn't want this cooler to sink with it. I felt we wouldn't have any chance.
I looked at Billy and I said to him, I could see the shoreline, and it really looked like it was 100 yards away. So I said to Bill, I don't know about you, Bill, but I can swim 100 yards. Not even taking into consideration all the clothes we had on and all of that stuff.
I mean, I thought it was 50 yards to shore. It's probably half a mile. I think I got maybe 50 feet, and I remember I went under. And it was dark out. So it was, the sky was gray, it was raining, and I distinctly remember going under, and I was just kind of weightless. And, I felt kind of peaceful, and I was just, I've described it, it was like a funnel coming out of the top of my head. And I could see myself on my Lanton Sport 10-speed racer, riding up Lake Avenue with my fishing rod tied to the bar on the bicycle. It was like memories coming out of my head. And then, and I couldn't figure out which way was up. And I wasn't panicked. I was just floating.
And I said, Billy, I've got the cooler. I'll come to you. Just don't flip the cooler. Just grab on gently and hang on. I think we can survive this.
While we were swimming away, I started to go down, and I went down 3 times. And the 3rd time, when I went down on my while I was sinking, I opened up my eyes, and for some reason I see a line. And the line was tied to the bow of the canoe, so I grabbed it and pulled myself towards it. Wow, this is starting to get really emotional for me.
And I remember, Ned's over here, Brian and I are on the cooler, and Brian just looked at me and he was scared, and he just said to me, whatever you do, don't knock the air pocket out of the cooler. And I went to speak, and I just threw up water. I guess I was having a near drowning experience. And I was shaking, and I held on. And then together, we basically had this thing that would hold us up. So we kind of said, let's kick our feet, let's do the breaststroke, let's get towards shore. And Ned was being blown behind us, but he was still probably 20 or 30 feet behind us.
From the beating of all the waves before Billy and I left the canoe to strike out towards shore, because of the pounding of the waves and everything, as the canoe was listing from side to side, air would escape. You could hear it. And once it lost most of the air, all of our stuff, our backpacks, everything, they just, fishing poles, shotguns, everything, just sunk right to the bottom.
We made it to shore, and we climbed up on shore in total exhaustion. Blue, we were blue, we were shivering, we were cold, and it was still storming. Ned, however, was probably 50 yards behind us.
And we got, I was in the water for a long time. I don't know how long. Brian and Billy would probably be better judges of that than I would, but it seemed like forever. It seemed like I was never going to get to shore.
I remember, realizing we were in shallow enough water to stand up, because it was probably mid-thigh or something like that. Because I remember I stood, and suddenly it started in my hands, and just every muscle in my body contracted and cramped. And that's probably the most severe pain I've ever been in. I just fell to my knees, and I was just kneeling in the water, my feet, my everything. And I think it was the hypothermia. And it was like you had to kind of just stretch everything out again and try to move. And Brian got to shore, and we got to where we were like in ankle deep water. We have the cooler, we're looking at Ned, and we're at this point, sort of where there's a bay over here. We were trying to cross that way. This would take us down to where we started in the morning, and we see Ned kind of drifting past it. And I think it was Brian who said, Ned, take the canoe and turn it. We could see it was hitting bottom, and turn yourself towards shore.
Once it sank completely, just like I said, just the bow was sticking out. But it was straight up and down in the water. And I guess it started hitting bottom. And Brian and Billy could see that. I couldn't. And nor did I feel it, because, like I said, I was in a state of shock. I really was. And I was for a couple of days after that. But they saw the canoe, and they started yelling at me to start turning the canoe. So I started turning it, but I was turning it the wrong way, and I was sending myself back out into the lake, into the cove. And they started screaming the other way, the other way. So I started turning it the other way, and it started taking me closer and closer to shore. And I finally, I really don't know if my feet hit the bottom or I just started swimming. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but we got to shore, and Billy told me that the canoe was filled with water, and once I got my feet onto shore, I grabbed the canoe and I started trying to drag it up, and it was filled with water, and I was, I guess I was afraid to let go of it. I think that's what was going on in my head.
We brought Ned into shore. He was probably in the water a good 45 minutes longer than we were. We got him to shore. We laid him down on the shore, and Bill and I decided it was time to go on a scavenger hunt and see what we could retrieve. We found a container of Coleman fuel. We found one of the backpacks that had emptied out that still had one of the little two-man pup tents attached to it. We found one sleeping bag that had made its way to the shoreline. And that was pretty much it.
My memory of our inventory was we found one of the tents, a two-man tent. We found an orange tarp, like about a, 8 by 10 tarp. I think in the cooler we had a fillet knife and an onion and a bottle of ketchup. I think it must have been in the cooler. I don't really think we found much else, but we got that on shore. Maybe we found a paddle, I don't know.
The only pack that floated was Brian's, and in it was a tent. And a few other things, articles of clothing, I don't exactly remember, but we spent the next, bunch of days. There was a can of potatoes left in the cooler and something else, I'm not quite sure. But we ate those, and then we went a bunch of days without food.
And we went back to Ned, and I remember when we got back to Ned, even though it was raining, he was covered from head to toe in black flies. And he was just shaking uncontrollably.
Which later on would cause me an awful lot of problems because of the amount of toxins or whatever the black flies pumped in me. From biting me, my body would just swell up, and it would stay and be, like really hot, like a bee sting, except throughout my whole body.
And over the course of about the next 4 or 5 days, we would hear planes, we'd get in the canoe, we'd wave this tarp, and scream and yell. I mean, and looking back at it, the idea of screaming and yelling at a plane that's, 1,500 feet in the air with an engine roaring, it's like, as if they're going to hear you. But it seemed the right thing to do, and we were desperate.
And it was kind of weird because I think it was like after about the third day, and I had no experience in survival conditions at all. But after 3 days, your stomach really doesn't let you know you're hungry. It kind of stops growling, and it just stops.
We would set up the tent facing into the woods, and this one morning, Brian and Ned got up before me. There are like a couple of holes in the screen in the tent. You could see bugs coming in. Just, we were bug bit, we were sunburned. They got out in the boat, and they were paddling around to get out in the breeze away from the bugs. I stayed in the tent. I'm not like a late sleeper, but that morning I slept late. And I got up, and I came out of the tent, and I sort of came past the line of the tent to look to shore where they were, and there's a wolf. And this wolf's maybe like, 25, 30 feet from me. And he's looking at me, and I'm looking at him. And I just, there were a couple of thoughts that went through my head, like, is this some kind of a test, like another test of what I can withstand? But I knew the fillet knife was hanging from one of the ropes on the tent, so I bent down to get the fillet knife, and as I came back up, there was no wolf. And I was by myself, so I kind of looked around a lot, and I was listening for noise and stuff. And I walked down to shore, and I'm looking for Ned and Brian in the canoe. And I was trying to yell and whistle to them, but my mouth was dry. It was like trying to whistle with saltines. But I think I saw them. I must have walked along shore a little bit. So they came to shore. They got me. I got in the boat. We paddled around the boat. It was a calm day, and the bugs weren't as bad out there. And I told them what happened. The whole bending down, getting up, and they kind of made fun of me, but they also said, I said to them, I think I did, but I don't know. So that afternoon, that night, we were at camp, and we're sitting around, me and Ned and Brian, and I'm sitting next to Ned, and Ned hits me on the leg, and he says, "Holy shit, Billy Moore." He says, "There's your wolf."
And all of a sudden, out of the woods, comes a dog. A yellow dog, looked like Old Yeller. And we didn't know whether this dog was vicious, rapid, wild, whatever. And Ned said, "Come here, you old son of a gun." And that dog jumped right up on his chest and he petted it. And we thought, Bill and I, there's dinner. If we get too bad, there's dinner. And Ned said, or Billy said, one of the two, I can't remember which one. So the day before, when we went on a scavenger hunt, he saw the dog, but he didn't know whether to tell us or not because we think he was crazy. But the dog was for real. And now we had a little bit of spark of survival, that if the dog could survive out there, that we should at least be able to survive the 7 days till the plane comes looking for us.
I think it was Billy. He woke up one morning and went out of the tent. And he came back saying there's a wolf laying out on the beach. By the time we all got out of the tent, it was gone. And I went and looked, and sure enough, there were tracks on the beach. And the next morning we woke up, and sure enough, it was not a wolf, it was a dog.
Finally, on the 7th day, when we knew the airplane would be coming to look for us, we could hear it. And the plane came up the river. It stayed on the far side of the lake. We were waving and screaming. He can't hear you. He's in an airplane. Never saw us. Went up the river, turned around, came back, went down the river, and off into the distance, and the engine sound was gone. That's when Ned turned to us and said, "We're never getting out of here. We're never going to get out of here." And we said, "Don't worry, Ned. We're going to take the canoe. He'll come back and look for us tomorrow. We'll go to the other side of the lake." And so the next morning, we got in the canoe and we headed towards the other side of the lake.
We finally crossed the lake and I don't remember if we brought the dog with us in the canoe or if the dog found his way back. But we crossed the lake, or at least crossed the cove, and then we saw another dog on the shoreline, a smaller dog, 40 pounds, 30 pounds. And I guess when the Indians go, they don't bring the dogs with them. They leave the dogs to fend for themselves. And even this young dog, I looked at him, and all his teeth are worn down, not like a dog we would have here. This guy was pretty scurvy.
And we got to a spot at the end of the lake. What we saw was we could see there was a camp there, an Indian camp. So that was kind of a lift. And when I say Indian camp, what I mean is you could see that the trees had been cut and poles had been tied together so that there were frames for lean-tos. And there was ground that was kind of cleared in spots, and you could see maybe where they had a cooking fire or something. There was no cabin, there was no tent or anything. So we pulled the boat up there and we began to look around and see what we could find. And all of a sudden there's another dog, a smaller dog. So now there's the two dogs and us. And we're digging around, and suddenly Brian screams, "I found matches."
And we found some Ohio blue tip matches. And it was really quite surreal after that. We found these matches, and the matches strike on anything. And we break these pine boughs and pile them up high and start a fire, which is something we couldn't do when we were on the other side of the lake because everything had sunk and we didn't have any flint or steel. We didn't have anything to make a fire. And everybody said, "Well, what about the Boy Scout method with the bow?" And you need a hardwood and a softwood to do that. And where we were, it was predominantly pine and white birch, predominantly. I mean, that's all there was. And they're both softwoods. And besides that, I don't think any of us thought about it. We were not survival kind of guys, any of us. We were there to go fishing and enjoy ourselves. I mean, I'll even go so far as to tell you that the canoe was completely overloaded because we had 3 cases of Molson beer. I mean, all kinds of stuff.
If we had food, we could cook. Well, we didn't have food, but we had 3 bouillon cubes that had survived the backpack.
And I like to cook, and I learned to cook because of these camping trips I took with Brian, because Brian would always try to take over the cooking, and he would just put so much hot stuff, chili, in the food that I couldn't eat it. So here we are, we've got this fire, and I think he tried to make a soup out of ketchup and onion. And after having not eaten for like 5-6 days, my stomach was like all shrunk up. That wasn't going to work for me.
And there was an old abandoned pot, regular 1-quart soup pot. And we cleaned it out as best we could with sand and water, rinsed it out, put 3 cups of water in it, and boiled it up, and put the bouillon soup in it, and poured it through Billy's shirt to get all the impurities out of that were coming off the sides of the pot while it was cooking.
You know, and you get strange after that much time. So I remember talking to Ned and Brian about China, it being a really big country, how they eat, strange stuff in China.
And we shared our first meal in 7 days. Was just beef bouillon in a cup.
And I'm watching Ned, and I said, they eat dogs in China. And I guess I could tell Ned knew what I was coming up on, because suddenly Ned said, we're not eating the dogs. And without a moment's notice, Brian just said, Ned, Billy kills that dog. I'm eating it with him. When them dogs are done, you're next. So there was a little bit of tension between Ned and Brian. Ned and I were good friends. Brian and I were good friends. Ned and Brian knew one another through me. They didn't have a history together.
That night, a puppy showed up in our camp. Now we had 2 dogs. And the puppy couldn't have been much more than 10, 12 weeks old. It was just a little puppy, but it was the same kind of dog as the one that swam the whole way behind the canoe over to this other camp. And Bill said to Ned, we got plenty of food now. And Ned said, we're not killing the dogs, we'll take the dogs home with us.
Very shortly thereafter, a plane came by and saw the smoke and circled and came down and picked us up, and I guess they had been looking for us.
And these planes are unmistakable. You hear this loud engine. It's like a tractor trailer truck right next to you. And we grab the pine boughs, we throw them on the fire, and we're staring at him. And we've got the tarp and we're waving it, and he waggles his wings to let us know that he saw us. And it was like, I think we were all in tears at that point, because it was like, oh my God, we've finally been found.
And the first thing he said to us when he opened the door of the aircraft, you cost us a lot of money.
They speak French, we don't. They don't really speak English, so he's trying to say to us, where's all your stuff? And I think the 3 of us all at the same time in English are trying to tell him our version of what happened when we flipped over. And then I guess I stopped talking, and I'm just kind of watching him. And it was like he had this scowl on his face. And then suddenly I just said to him, like, you must have spent a lot of money looking for us. And he said, like, well, we've been looking for you for 2.5 days. We burned a lot of fuel. So I think at that point I might have said F you to him or something, because I don't know. But I remember Brian saying to me, like, Billy Moore, don't get into a fight with this guy. Just, they're here, let's get out of here. And Ned was trying to grab one of the dogs to get him on the plane, and they have these floating pontoons that the planes are on, and the guy kicked the dog off the plane, and now Ned's saying, like, what are you doing that for?
And the 3 of us were getting in the plane, and Brian wanted to bring one of the dogs with us. And we were pretty offended by the whole thing, because Brian picked the dog up and the guy just kicked him right off the plane.
And I guess there was some sort of a notice sent out, like, missing campers, be on alert. But we got in the plane and we were taken out of there.
So the first thing we do is we go into the grocery store and we buy a case of Molson and a bunch of Gouda cheese and cigarettes, and I take a drag off the cigarette, and it was like the first day I tried a cigarette when I was 13. I got dizzy, I turned green, I felt like throwing up.
We knew enough from our first trip there where we got everything wet to leave our wallets in the car. We had Brian's car. So when we get back, we had money. We might have even been smart enough to leave a change of clothing in the car. So we changed our clothes and we went and got cheeseburgers, which they grill. Somehow they have cheese on both sides of these things when they make them up there, and they flat grill them. But we had cheeseburgers and we had beer and we bought cigarettes and we were dying to smoke. And and the cheeseburger, I think I threw it up afterwards. You know, one beer, and I think I felt like I had had 6. Cigarettes made you dizzy, and it's like slowly you're coming back to life through your vices, eating, drinking, and smoking. But we got some food in us, we got gas, and we took the cooler and the tent and the tarp and the fillet knife, and we headed south through Chibougamau Park.
The Greenwich Police Department stopped at my house and left a card. A detective came looking. And I guess Air Canada Search and Rescue or somebody was looking for money for the fuel that was expended in the search for the 3 of us. And of course, being an upstanding citizen, I went to see the policeman, and thereafter did nothing.
You know, it affected all of us differently, but it affected all of us a lot. I know for me, when I got back from that trip, these trips were making me more and more self-sufficient as a person, like as a young man becoming a man, like cleaning up after myself and cooking for myself and doing things for myself. And this trip this event kind of solidified that. We pulled back into my parents' driveway, which was our first stop, and my dad asked, "Where's your stuff?" This was like the universal question, "Where's your stuff?" And we started to tell him what happened, and we're all telling him what happened, and we get all done, and he says, "But where's your stuff?" So it's like, I guess he's listening, but he's not hearing us. I lost 20 pounds in that 5.5, 6 days. And it's not like I have a lot of extra weight to lose.
We spent 7 days with nothing but water to drink and survived quite well, even with the horrific bug situation. We were eaten alive by the mosquitoes and the black flies, but we survived that too. And we've been back there several times since in quest of the world record brook trout, which we never caught. But we had some great experiences, and I think that was probably trip number 3. Trip number 3, I think it was, out of about 30-something trips that we've made.
And I've never been back since. That was, like I said, it was a long time ago. And since then, Billy has asked me a couple of times to go to Canada, but I just quite a bit older now. I don't want to sleep on the ground, and I certainly don't want to see all those bugs again. I ended up, when I got back to town, I ended up going to see, I had to go to the emergency room to see about my bug bites, because my body kept, even on the ride home, it would just blow up. I would look like, I felt like I had put on 150 pounds.
When we got back, Brian wrote to Igloo Cooler. And he called me and showed me. He got a letter back from Igloo Cooler, and he had told them briefly what had happened. And they said that although the Igloo Cooler is not a Coast Guard approved flotation device, they have heard of it being of aid to swimmers in distress. I remember those words. And then they said, but we've never heard a story quite like yours. And we would like to do an ad campaign based on what happened to you boys. And we want to give you each one of everything we make and give you a $100 release to do this ad. This is 1976. And we said, sure. I think we consulted Ned. My understanding is Ned doesn't think he got any Igloo products. I don't know if I have any of my stuff left, but probably lost it on other camping trips up there, which is another story. And Ned and Brian and I, there was a closeness we had after that is hard to describe. You know, we were through a near-death experience together. You know, Brian and I, Ned and I are still good friends. I don't see Ned as much as I'd like to, but you know, but I love both these guys. I mean, we went through that together.